Welcome to the Make Water Work podcast. I'm Isaac Pellerin, and I've been for the past 3 days at the SWAN Conference at their Smart Water Networks Forum. It's an annual conference bringing together water utility leaders, practitioners, engineering firms, and everyone who's really focused on what does it take to help drive innovation? How does innovation get adopted across the sector? And I think what's interesting about this conference in particular is that because it's global, we get to compare how things are done. We know that in the US, the market is very fragmented because we have 50 states, so it's not as centralized as it may be in some parts of Asia or Europe or in Australia. And so it brings up different ways that we solve for innovation. And so one of the things that I got to do that was really exciting was to run a roundtable with Anthony DeRosa from ASDWA. When I was talking to the folks at SWAN, they were like, with it being in Tampa this year, we'd love to have some conversation about how regulators play into digital transformation. What and how do utilities adopt new ideas, new practices, and those kind of things? And so it was a really natural fit to see if Anthony could represent the regulator persona at a roundtable so we could have a conversation about how regulation is part of the equation, and it's an important part, and it's not always something that hinders, but we did have some really great takeaways that I would love to share. We actually took 2 hours in two separate sessions with about 15 folks at our table, really just to explore the regulator's impact on digital transformation. So here's what we came up with. Our table challenge statement was that the waters sector's regulatory framework was built for a different era. When we're thinking about how can utilities adopt AI, what's the value of adopting that kind of thing? The governance is immature, and that makes sense. Like, this is moving really, really fast, and so it's important to have some considerations, not just about how we use it, but also how we take into account security and those kind of things. And without a regulatory framework, we're kind of left with some question marks to really say, hey, utilities are left to modernize at their own risk, not knowing if future regulation will change the way they need to work. And so we kind of came back with it would be helpful to have a regulatory framework that creates enough of a container that allows for utilities to explore and adopt that. Some of the key themes that we kept talking about was how we have the regulatory framework lag, and that it's important for governance to come, and for some of that to be governance and practices that are built right into uh, the utility operations, that it needs to be something that they think about and talk about, and that there's funding misalignment. And this is really important. A lot of the ways that we would build and have solutions that could be adopted are not necessarily built into the current procurement processes. And so, whether it's capital expenditure or operational expenditure, um, that can be a barrier. And then in our second session, we really hit more of what are the barriers to break through, what are some of the things that we can do practically to start doing that. And so, as a table, we talked about how we could find first movers and amplify them, how we could solve the most common problem, not just the hardest one. And this was a really important theme where we were noting how it can be exciting to engineer and build for new types of problems, or to try to solve the most complex problem, but not the most common one. If you only solve the most complex, that's going to hinder adoption. And so when it comes to things like standardizing reporting, how we treat data as an asset in the sector, that is, maybe the utility has a data set that has to be reported up to the regulator, or it contains information that needs to be communicated out to the public. Those are things that have to be done in a way that is accessible and understood both by regulators and by utilities. And so, in doing that, it can help create those first use cases that help us standardize and centralize on how we're going to get things moving. And then this was an important thing that someone brought up at the table that as we design solutions, we have to be designing for who's going to use it. And so when you look at the U.S. market, 60% workforce is a field, someone who is working in the field, not necessarily at a desk, at a laptop. So the tools that they use have to be AI powered, AI enabled, and built for to be used in the field. And that, lastly, that reform funding has to include sustainability, not just deployment. So we can't just deploy funds to have a solution and then those funds go away. We have to figure out ways to have those funds be embedded and so that utilities can work with tools that are sustainable and that are improving along with them because again, data is an asset. It has to be updated, it has to be groomed, it has to be kept up to date so that it moves at the pace of innovation. And so it's been such a joy to be at Swan, to interact with everyone here. It's a phenomenal network that really is bringing ideas to help push the industry forward and ensure that we're not doing it at the cost of leaving others behind.